So welcome everyone. This is Karl Newell with Remax West, and today we're going to dive into all things real estate. I'm here with Timothy Brooks, an experienced real estate lawyer who's going to share some valuable insight into the legal side of real estate transactions, everything from contracts to potential pitfalls and how to protect one's interest in this complex real estate market. So whether you're a first-time home buyer, a seasoned investor, or a fellow real estate professional, there's something here for everyone. Let's dive in. Welcome, Timothy.
Thank you, Carl, for having me.
No problem. Can you explain the role of a real estate lawyer and the role that they play in a real estate transaction?
It's a great question, Carl. Real estate lawyers, what do we do? There's a number of things that we do during the transaction. Of course, one of the main things that we do is we do something called due diligence. What that looks like is we're going to check out the property. We're going to make sure there's no issues, that there's no liens. Some liens that we often will see are things like property taxes, personal taxes. Sometimes the purchaser or the seller may have even pending outstanding child support claims related to their name. And so when we do searches, we want to make sure that if I'm representing the purchaser, my buyer client is not taking on any of those debts or liens or responsibilities. Mm-hmm. We also will check for things like furnaces. Popular in 2024, where a Reliance furnace contract would be registered on title. So we need to make sure that if my client is buying it, that the furnace is assumed by the buyer through the lawyers. We'll have contracts finalized to deal with that. And so those are some of the main things we do. We also will deal with receiving funds from the lender. As simple as that may sound, that can be quite extensive. Every lender will have different responsibilities, different things they're looking for. So one lender might require a specific type of ID for ID verification, or they're going to ask for certain documents to be signed. And every lender, depending on that lender, will have different requirements, which can lead to a lot of back and forth. We also will meet with the clients for signing. We'll go through documentation with them. We'll gather, of course, home insurance. We'll also get on the day of closing, we'll receive the funds from the mortgage company. So we will steward those funds. We receive the funds from the client. We communicate with the client, the realtor, the broker. So there's a lot of communication typically happening on the back end. And then, of course, throughout the transaction, we'll always advise the client as well.
Awesome. Very good. So what are the most common legal issues that first-time homebuyers face, and how can they prepare for these?
The most common thing that I see with first-time homebuyers is the unknown. That's always the thing that's overarching, and with the unknown leads to sometimes fear, a bit of anxiety. Mm-hmm. And so ways that first-time homebuyers can bridge that is be as prepared as possible. Get your mortgage approval done as early and often as possible. And when I say pre-approval, I mean going through your whole credit check, verifying that you are truly viable for the purchase that you're buying. Uh-huh. The biggest thing that I see is a shortened timeline, or they thought they had a pre-approval, or they thought they were approved for a mortgage only to find out later they weren't, which kind of creates a bit of anxiety.
Yeah.
So being as early as possible is great. It allows our office to have things prepared well ahead of time, as opposed to a day or two before closing. While our office can do it a day or two before closing, again, that heightens the stress and the communication and the when we're going to meet with you and when we're going to receive funds, and it creates a domino effect. So the earlier the better. And so I would say first-time home buyer, be early, be prepared, know your budget, work with your broker to make sure that you can really afford what you're purchasing, given the rates. Work with your realtor to really understand what your affordability is, because it will always show itself later on.
Right. Yeah, that's why I always tell my first-time home buyers, listen, the first thing you want to do is ensure that you have a pre-approval or approval in place, so you understand what you're getting into, so that there's no stress along the way, right?
Exactly.
And you mentioned about title insurance earlier. What is that, and why is that important?
So it's a very good question, Carl. Title insurance is something separate from home insurance. Okay, they're two fundamentally different things. Title insurance is an insurance that protects title. Title is a common one that is popular. Is unfortunately sometimes there is ID fraud, and so never through our office, but we have seen in the news where ID theft has occurred and a mortgage was taken out in somebody's name without them knowing. And so if you have title insurance, they'll cover you through that process. Something common for our office that we see after closing, our client purchases the property and we get an email, we get a phone call that the previous property taxes or hydro bill or utility bills were not paid. That's a common one. One that I see more interesting with a colleague of mine recently is purchase happened with a new build and the closing occurred, and it turns out that the builder's lawyer basically registered, they did some registrations incorrectly in terms of what was sent between law offices, and the client actually ended up buying the wrong unit. And there has to be a title fix that had to occur after closing. And so, again, that's something that's dealt with through title insurance. Things that you want to be aware of with title insurance, though, is if you're doing renovations, extensive renovations, and you're building a new fence, you're making changes that will require a permit approval, things like that, it will not typically be covered through title insurance unless you have disclosed it to them. And so it's different than a construction loan, and it only protects title. Home insurance, however, deals with the actual structure of the home, meaning if there's a fire and the home is burnt down, or if there was a slip and fall in front of your home, or if there was a roof leak, basement, things that happen in the basement, mold buildup, things like that. Home insurance steps in to make sure that you're protected. So it's a little bit different than title insurance. Title insurance also will remain with title so long as you maintain ownership of that property. You'll always will have title insurance, and your purchaser lawyer will always make sure that you have a policy issued to you in the event of anything happening.
Okay. So how does one obtain title insurance?
So as a lawyer, our office, we have a relationship with the title insurance providers. Okay. We're working on the fly here, but there are 3 or 4 in Canada. There's Chicago Title, there's Stewart Title, there's FCT, and the 4th one is actually through Law Society of Ontario. But there's 4 title insurance providers that are available in Canada, or in Ontario rather, and most law offices will work with typically 1 or 2 of them. Our office, we work frequently with 2 of them, being Stewart Title and Chicago Title, and we will order the policy on your behalf.
Okay, very good. And so what are some red flags buyers and sellers should look out for in a purchase agreement?
Good question. Again, conditions to look out for. Things that I see in the agreement. Number 1, it sounds silly, but the purchase price. So the purchase price, being very aware of what you're purchasing, how much is really worth in relation to the market. One of the horror stories that we see is client purchases a property for $850,000, only to find out an appraiser from the mortgage company comes out 3 weeks later or a month later and appraises the property at $800,000, and it has a massive impact on their mortgage and what they can afford. So as silly as it sounds, the actual price can be an indirect red flag. So being informed about proper price before making the offer is critical. Some of the clauses in the agreement, sometimes they can be vague. Okay, if someone might say, an example of top of mind might be, the seller agrees to clean the carpet. And yes, cleaning the carpet could mean a number of things to a number of different people. So carpet cleaning for one might mean I want professionally cleaned, steam cleaned, I expect no spots in it. And another person a version of cleaning might be, I swept the carpet. And and that can create some ambiguity. Obviously it's a innocuous example, but there are other examples where it can really rear its head. And if there's something important to you when you're buying the property, Last week, I spoke to a client. They're buying a property and they're purchasing a property with a pool. But of course, it's wintertime now, and the pool is really important to them. They had many clauses about it in the agreement, and I really encourage them to do all that they can to do as much due diligence as it relates to the pool, tighten up some of those clauses, because it can rear its head later on. So sometimes the clauses could be a red flag. And then some of the other things that we'll also see is, silly as it sounds again, appliances or some of the chattels. Again, if could be lack of clarity on what fridge or what stove or what is staying, what isn't staying. And because it wasn't properly written into the agreement on closing, it becomes a controversy. One person says, "Oh, I would expect it to have 2 fridges," but the agreement says 1 fridge.
Right.
So just paying attention to some of those details as it relates to chattels, conditions, price is very, very important.
Yeah, that's good, because I completely agree. Purchase price is extremely important, because even in 2022, a lot of people were purchasing homes way above the value, and when the banks would go and appraise the property, the values weren't coming in.
Yep.
So that's why it's important to work with your realtor to find out what the comparables are around the area, around that particular property, just to ensure that you're purchasing the property for what it's worth. That's a very good point.
Yeah.
So, a lot of people think buying a condo is exactly the same as buying a freehold property. Based on my experience, it's not always the same. Like, what are the legal aspects buyers should consider when purchasing a condo, especially when it comes to the status certificate?
So purchasing a condo, I'll do a small plug, is sometimes a great way to get into the market. Let's be candid, purchasing a detached or a freehold town, depending on where the market's at, may not be in everyone's affordability range. And so a condo really represents, or a condo townhome really represents, sometimes an opportunity for people who are entering the market to get it at a more affordable price range.
Right.
And when I'm looking at a condo purchase or a condo townhome, there is something called a status certificate, which we'll review. Things that we'll look at is some of the history. So has there ever been any litigation? Have they been sued for anything, for slip and falls? I'll look to see if there's been any recent construction that's happened in the condo, major construction being changes to the windows, changes to the garage, or if there's been any structural questions with the condo that needs to be fixed by a company that might require engineers. Typically, those things can rear its head later on, because you might purchase the condo, your condo fee might be $396 a month, but there's a pending repair for a structural beam in the garage. That structural beam ends up being $500,000 to fix. And typically you may end up seeing a special assessment later on, or special assessment is basically where there's a one-time levy or fee added that you might have to pay over 3 or 6 months. And that could create stress to your budget, of course. And so doing as much due diligence to make sure you're aware of course, the condo status certificate, will also indicate your monthly condo fees, what's included in the condo fees, so water, hydro, sometimes even cable as well might be covered in your condo fees, depending on the condominium. And so it's kind of good to know, because again, that will inform your budget. And then some of the other things I mentioned earlier.
Right. And after working with you for some time, I realized that sometimes the listing agent will put something on the listing, like they will say hydro is included in the maintenance fee. And then when you look at the status certificate, hydro is not there. So it's so important to have your lawyer review, and Tim does an excellent job at this, reviewing the status certificate, so that you as a buyer have an understanding of what you're getting into. Because sometimes there's mistakes that's on the listing, but the status certificate will really verify everything. So regarding new construction properties, what legal aspects should buyers be aware of when purchasing pre-construction?
New construction, it's great. It's really, really great. as a lawyer who used to work at Cherry On, so I dealt with a lot with new builds prior to starting my own practice. And one of the big things with new builds that I'm seeing now is price. Going back to what we talked about earlier, many of the clients that have purchased new builds 2021 to say 2022, early 2023, the price that they purchased it at, again, the mortgage companies are no longer valuing it at what they purchased it. And it's created issues where clients are figuring out ways to come with extra money to complete the transaction. So price is a huge thing to consider when you're buying a new build. So it sounds cliche, but it's huge. And then making sure you get a lawyer to review your new build contract is so important. I can't tell you how many times I've helped a new build client. In a new build agreement, there will be fees that are not common to a standard purchase transaction. So things like development charges, driveway paving fees, other levies that if you haven't had a lawyer review that agreement to potentially have those clauses removed, it can really end up paying a big price tag. I've seen it as much as 20, 25K extra in costs and fees, sometimes even 30K in these fees and development charges. And if you're not prepared for it financially, it can be really, really stressful. So that's a huge one. I would also say, if you're purchasing a new build, having really strong clarity about whether you're going to be living there or not. When you do buy a new build, their CRA or Revenue Canada will charge HST on that build. Typically, the HST is remitted by the builder to Revenue Canada. However, if you're not going to be living in the home, the builder cannot access a HST rebate. The HST rebate is $24,000. It cannot be used, cannot be utilized. And again, that could be an extra cost brought down to you. So you could be dealing with, between development charges, HST rebates, extra 40 to 50K in costs that are unforeseen. Bear in mind, and I want to make sure I say this, the builder is not required to give you the HST rebate. So I've seen transactions, again, we're in the middle of the transaction, the builder suspects that you will not be living in the home or a family member won't be living in the home. They say, listen, we're not going to allow you to exercise this rebate, and they require the purchaser or client to pay HST on the purchase price, which again can really inflate closing costs. So things to be aware of when you're buying a new build: clarity as to whether you're going to be living in there, cost, and again, having a lawyer review the contract and fees to see if it can A, be removed, and then B, just advise you on what to expect so that you're not surprised later on.
Yeah, that's great. And again, I know you mentioned purchase price again, but this is so important. This is why we continue to emphasize this, especially if you bought a pre-construction in 2021 or 2022. The likelihood going into 2025, or if your property closes beyond that, the values of your property, unfortunately, likely would have gone down. So it's important to prepare for your mortgage approval way beforehand, so that you have an idea of what you're getting yourself into. Even if the bank can appraise the property like before, so that you can prepare yourself for the reduction in the purchase price you bought it for. It's good to be prepared.
And to add to that, Karl, because we've been on some new build closings, you and I, and one of the things that might be helpful as well is sometimes the builder has a preferred lender. Usually it's an A-level bank, RBC, CIBC, and typically that bank will honor the purchase price regardless of what happens a little bit with the market. And so if one of the ways you can stem concern, although not ideal for mortgage brokers, is to see if you can be approved with that actual bank. So, yes, the rate might be slightly higher depending on the circumstances, because of course it could be better competitive rates. But, for example, more recently, we're dealing with a scenario where there was a significant drop in value of the property that's being purchased. And if that client was able to get a mortgage approval with RBC, RBC would have honored the actual purchase price as opposed to what the value of the price is today, because RBC had a relationship with that builder. So sometimes that's something to think about, which means having your financial picture, credit, employment, all those things in place so that you can actually be approved through the preferred lender of the builder, because that will avoid stress later on.
Yeah. This tip that Timothy just gave can save you like hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? So if you want a little bit more information on that, just reach out to any one of us. Trust me, it can save you a lot of money, right? Regarding closing, what are some common problems that arise on closing day?
The most common one for us is the rush. So, I touched on it before. I don't know if I should be saying touched on it before, but I'll say it clear. We get mortgage information a day before closing, 2 days before closing. It creates a domino effect. And some people will wonder, well, what is domino effect? We get documentation. We have to book a meeting with the client. We have to send that documentation back to the lender. Lender sends us back 10 new requirements and says, we need these documents added to it. And now it's the day of closing and we need 7 new documents signed because we got it the day before closing.
Right.
So the biggest thing stress that we see is when we get mortgage information late, and that will incur additional costs for you because, as a law office, we might have 8 other closings or 9 other closings scheduled that day because we can't impact our other clients, and we've received something a day before, which really puts our day in a crunch. And this is where you might see additional costs for rush fees and things like that. And so ways you can avoid that, common ones that create stress on the day of closing, late documentation. Sometimes the lender will come up with new requirements on the day of closing. Mm-hmm. So, it's 11:30 on closing day, and the lender says to us, we need a certain declaration signed by the client before we will release the mortgage proceeds to your office. Mm-hmm. And we're at the mercy of the lender. And we, we have to get it signed. It has to be reviewed from the lender's side, from a funder or underwriter on that side, which means we may not receive funds till 3 or 4 o'clock in the day. Right. That's a common one. So I would say on the day of closing, and then the common one we see as well is people are moving that day. They're buying, they're selling, they might be moving out of an apartment into the place. A big stressor for us is you're buying the property from somebody that day, you show up to the property at 1 o'clock, and the seller is still moving out. And, you may have paid for movers. You may have made other arrangements to make sure that the property is cleaned, other variables that could be happening that day. And that can also create a bit of a collide, I guess, if I could say it.
Right. To avoid that stressor of, you're dealing with multiple properties. This is to my potential sellers and buyers. Mm-hmm. Dealing with multiple properties on a particular day can be stressful, as Timothy mentioned. So it might be a good idea in some circumstances to get a bridge loan, mm-hmm. where you can close on the property you're going to buy or you've purchased, mm-hmm. Before you actually close on the property you are selling.
Correct.
Again, it can be kind of complex, but for more information, you can reach out to us. But it can reduce a lot of stress on closing day. Regarding, we work with a lot of investors as well.
Yes.
What are specific legal concerns that investors should keep in mind when dealing with rental properties?
So there's 2 that really come to mind when I have investor clients coming in. 1, get a tax advice. As a lawyer, not an accountant, I'm not a tax advisor, so we can't really delve into the tax advice aspects of things. But some things to think about for tax advice is capital gains. Okay, you buy a property gains in value, there's going to be a larger tax, and something you're going to want to be prepared for. And also the second one is going to be getting some type of agreement, whether it's a joint venture agreement or joint venture is usually for one particular venture, but if you're doing multiple ones, then you might have more of a investor contract general. But the long story short is, you really want to have, if you have multiple investors, you're gonna want to have an agreement in place. I can't tell you again how many times I've seen in my office where one investor's life circumstances are changing. They are gone through a separation. Their financial picture has changed for whatever reason. Health, could be other variables, and they want out, or they want something different than what the other investors have in mind in terms of timeline, and it creates conflict.
Right.
And so having a really well-written contract, again, something that we help with, is really, really important, because it will help get out ahead of some of those issues before. And so I would say there's that aspect. And then I guess if there's a third I could add to that, is really in that investment contract, a really clear understanding of who does what. So again, common one is, one person is a silent investor, they come with great capital, that's wonderful. But then there's another investor who's been actively involved in dealing with tenants and dealing with renovations and dealing with day-to-day operations. And there sometimes becomes an issue where there's an imbalance in terms of compensation from one party to the other, because one has been more actively involved. Again, something you want to make sure you've really hammered out and captured in your investment contract or joint venture agreement, so that you can have a better understanding and it avoids conflict later on.
Awesome. Regarding estate sales and inheritance, what legal considerations should buyers or sellers be aware of when dealing with estate sales or inherited properties?
So this is, again, good question. And a lot of that is left for us, Karl and myself. Karl, if he's listing a property to, and it's an estate sale, he will get a power of attorney document, or he will get something indicating that this person is what we call an estate trustee, meaning they have been authorized by the estate to sell the property or act on behalf of. And he'll get that documentation, he'll verify identification. As an added layer, I will also get documentation, that same documentation, I will review it, I will ask questions. I also have to send that documentation to the other lawyer, because again, it is a heightened concern for the potential issue of title fraud. And so ways that we do that is we do our due diligence as much as we can to make sure that the person who is selling that property on behalf of the estate is doing it with the proper authorization. But again, with estate sales, it also creates a great opportunity. Estate sales are great because typically, or transactions are great for the purchaser side, because typically that property might need some renovation, might need some work. I'm not saying it's devalued, but there's a great opportunity for that property to grow in value with some changes. Usually if it's an estate sale, it might be a bit outdated. And also, from what I've seen with estate sales, the people who are selling the property, or the estate that sell the property, is a bit not as emotionally as attached to the transaction as a property that you necessarily may live in day out. And so it creates a great opportunity for buyer clients as well.
Yeah, absolutely. When I'm working with sellers of estate sales, obviously our goal is to get the highest and best price possible, and we do that. However, I believe Timothy is completely right regarding this. For buyers, there's a lot of opportunities in estate sales. I worked with a buyer last year in 2024, where they purchased a property almost $150,000 undervalued, simply because it was a estate sale. The seller wanted to get rid of it as soon as possible. So Timothy is absolutely right regarding that. I can attest to that. Last question here. Regarding market trends and legal implications, how have recent changes in the Canadian real estate market affected the legal landscape for buyers and sellers?
So I'll answer this perspective from my office. Of course, Karl, you're probably seeing on, with the offers and transactions happening, it's obviously maybe not as much traction. It's harder to finalize a transaction. But what we're seeing from my end is mortgage companies, their underwriting is is more cautious than ever before.
Mm-hmm.
So we might work with Scotiabank, for example, was one of the many lenders that we work with. And 2 years ago, Scotiabank may not ask for the level of documentation for the same transaction that they'll ask for now. And that's truly a reflection of interest rates. As interest rates continue to rise, access to funds is harder to get.
Right.
And by extension, the underwriters are more cautious. Not to say that they weren't cautious before, but it's a little bit more difficult. And some of the things that people have to go through to get mortgage approval now is much more difficult. And then obviously the affordability, how much you can afford, how much you can approved for. So I guess the market trend that I've seen is harder to get mortgages approved. Clients that I sometimes would assume to be great clients, always did A deals with us, are having to go into alternative lending options because of different circumstances, property value dipping, things like that. And so yeah, that's been the biggest market trend I've seen. Much harder to get financing. By extension, it means that sellers, of course, when listings go up now, presumably in the market there hasn't been as much traction. But the beauty for 2025, because we are in 2025 now, is that's changing.
Right.
The past month and a half in our office, we've seen a great uptick in transactions happening. So at our office, we do a lot of refinances as well. Sometimes people think real estate lawyer, they think sale purchases, but there's a ton of our work that comes through refinances where people are consolidating debt or they're taking equity out of their property to prepare to go back into the market to do an investment opportunity. And I can say we worked right through Christmas Eve, right through the Christmas holidays. It's been extremely busy, and that tells me that there is a strong preparation happening for the spring market. I would say to both sellers and buyers, with rates continuing to drop, there's going to be more action. Buyers, that will mean there's going to be a bit more competition.
Right. Sellers, that might mean you might get some more appealing offers or more competitive offers, in that you might get, instead of 2 offers, you might get 6 offers. So I think there's definitely some volume in the past month and a half that we've noticed quite a bit. Awesome, great. Timothy, we appreciate this interview. I think our audience is going to find this very valuable. So where can potential buyers, sellers, investors, or people just going to refinance their home, where can they find you? How can they reach out to you?
So there's a number of different ways you can find us. You can find us on social media. Our firm is TB Law PC on social media, so it's on Instagram. I'm on Facebook as well. My website, tblaw.ca, is where you can find me. I'm sure Karl will attach our email or phone number, but our email and phone number will be there as well. You'll see that on our website. You'll also see it on our Instagram. We would love to work with you. And I think one of the beauties, and Karl can attest to it, is our firm is really customer service focused. We're about helping you. And that means sometimes contacting us as early as you can. Sometimes people think contacting the real estate lawyer with the transaction is already firm or complete is the best. But sometimes speaking to us early just to understand the process. Right. Again, especially for first-time homebuyers or people who may not be as familiar with the process, earlier the better. So have that conversation with us. We'd like to speak with you and answer any questions you might have.
Very good. Awesome. Thank you, Tim. We appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you.